Welcome to this episode of the Disease du Jour podcast on the topic of horses losing weight with Clair Thunes, PhD, a private equine nutritionist. I'm your host, Kim Brown, publisher of Equine Management. The Disease du Jour podcast is brought to you in 2022 by Merck Animal Health. Dr. Thunes is an equine nutritionist who owns Clair Equine Nutrition based in Gilbert, Arizona. Dr. Thunes works as a consultant with veterinarians, horse owners, and trainers globally to take the guesswork out of feeding horses, and she provides services to select companies. As a nutritionist, she works with all equids, from leg competitors to miniature donkeys and everything in between. Born in England, she earned her undergraduate degree at Edinburgh University in Scotland and her master's and doctorate in nutrition at the University of California, Davis. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Thunes.
Hi, it's great to be here. Yeah, it's always fun to chat with you, Kim.
Well, we're really happy to have you here today, and this is a little bit different because we're talking today about horses that veterinarians have not diagnosed with an underlying physical problem that would make them lose weight, correct?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction, right? Because we always want to make sure that we don't have some medical issue going on, whether that's their teeth need doing, or they've got issues with internal parasites, or something like PPID Cushing's, or some other reason that they might be losing weight. Those need to be ruled out. So yes, we're talking about otherwise healthy horses.
Okay, so the other thing is that we often talk about horses losing weight in the winter months. But what about in the summer? What are you seeing horses that just lose weight in the summer months, and what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I live in Gilbert, Arizona. It is really hot here right now. I think it's 115 today. And although people say it's a dry heat, we're in monsoon season, so we're about 45% humidity. So, it's pretty warm out. And we do see horses losing weight in the summer. And interestingly, I tend to notice it more in the thoroughbred types than the warm blood types. They seem to be a little bit more sensitive, but it is a bit of a battle. It's kind of our winter, compared to everywhere else. And so the heat plays a role. And then the other thing that I think plays a role is that I notice some of the horses that struggle to maintain weight are also those that are a little bit more sensitive to flies. So, when there's flies in the barn, if they're stomping their feet, we don't think about that, but that's constant movement, right? That constant agitation of stomping their feet, burning calories. It's also stressful, right? Being bugged by flies is stressful. Like, you're just always on edge because you just can't get away from them. So, using fans and things to keep the flies off is really helpful, fly stuff. But, some of these horses, even with fly sheets and boots and whatever, they're still pretty miserable. We get mosquitoes coming in. We're in an area where they irrigate. So the mosquitoes can get really, I've seen horses almost present like they're having colic. They're so bugged by the mosquitoes, throwing themselves against panels to itch because they're so itchy. And I've seen those same horses really struggling to maintain weight. It's like they're always moving, they're always agitated, they're bugged by the flies. And then just the heat. And I think a lot of the diets, we always want to feed forage first, but forage is digested through fermentation in the hindgut. It's not a fully efficient process. And so as a result, it generates heat. And I think we've all heard as horse owners in the wintertime, to help keep our horses warmer, we should feed more forage because it does ferment and it does generate heat. But it's doing that in the summer too. So, here's my horse standing outside, 105, 108, 90, whatever your hot temperature is. And we're feeding him lots of forage, and his internal combustion engine is cranking out heat internally while he's being beat on, by the external heat. That can actually make horses, I think, they can not eat as much or as well, because it's just not, they're not stupid. They know that eating all this hay is, is uncomfortable in a sense. So it can be useful sometimes to change what you feed a little bit in the summer if you've got one of these horses, and maybe not. I always want to just to be clear, I always want to make sure there's plenty of forage in the feed, but maybe, in the summer, it's a time to find something that's a little bit more efficiently digested to help supplement your hay. So you can cut back a little bit on your hay, and that'll help some horses.
Such as what? Give us an example of that maybe, and you can help us.
Yeah, so I mean, I would first off try and stick with, fiber sources if I can. There are some fiber sources out there that are easier to ferment. They're, for example, beet pulp, soybean hulls, those kinds of ingredients are more readily fermentable. So it's more, effective. They can ferment that more easily than they can ferment hay. So yes, there'll be some heat generated off of that still, but it's not going to be, it doesn't take as long to do. So, and they get more calories out of it too. So for example, pound for pound, if you were to feed a pound of hay, a pound of beet pulp is going to give you about 1.3 megacalories per pound, somewhere in that region. A pound of hay is going to give you 1 megacalorie per pound. So you can actually get, the same calorie intake still coming from a fiber source from less total feed if you were to substitute some of your hay with something like beet pulp. And so you're going to end up feeding less total quantity of hay, and they'll get the same calorie intake. And there's research that's been done that shows that you can feed up to sort of 45-50% of their forage intake as beet pulp. So that's certainly something to look at. Obviously, the most calorie dense source of calories that we have is to feed fat. So feeding, say, an oil will get very high levels of calories into them off of a very small amount of feed. So, but obviously, we often don't think about fat and rancidity, and obviously heat and fat don't always go together.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure that your fat sources are stable. I always like to try and feed, if I'm going to do an oil, I want to do an oil that's got some omega-3 in it. So I'm getting a little bit of other benefit beyond just the calories. I'm getting some of that omega-3 that helps regulate inflammatory processes in the body. But that means you're looking at things like flaxseed oil, and they're not super stable in the heat. So you probably need to have somewhere to keep that cool, which can be a problem for some people because not all barns, have a refrigerator, or certainly not a refrigerator that you can keep a gallon jug of oil in.
Or even air-conditioned tack room. I mean,
we don't have an air-conditioned tack room. No, I mean, our tack room is, it's certainly cooler than outside, but it's not air-conditioned. It's a tin shed with, so it's still hot in there. So yeah, you have to think a little bit about that. Obviously, things like stabilized rice bran is higher in fat, and it's stabilized, so it should be okay in the hotter temperatures. And then obviously you have your higher fat feeds as well, right? So you have your high fat, high fiber, either performance feeds. There's some really nice senior feeds out there that are high fat, high fiber. Those tend, especially the senior feeds, tend to be pretty readily digestible. That's part of what we look at when we put together a senior feed, because we know our seniors don't digest things quite as well. So those tend to be a little more easily digestible, perhaps, or have very digestible ingredients in them. So those can be a good option for horses, and they're a little higher in calories again. You have to be careful that you're feeding the right amount. Again, it's about creating a balanced diet, right? So this applies to anybody, whether their horse needs to gain weight or not. And I think we've talked about this previously, the need to really balance your forage and provide what's missing in your forage. So either by using a ration balancer, or if you're going to do something like a senior or performance feed, you need to feed as much as it says on the bag. And for some underweight horses, that may be, you may be feeding them. You may be feeding 5, 6, 7, 8 pounds a day. If they're underweight and trying to get weight on them, that may not be an issue. But if you've got one that's just like a little bit under, or you're just trying to kind of, help kind of keep them where they need to be, and you're just feeding a couple of pounds, that's not going to give you everything you need, right? Those feeds are designed to be fed at higher quantities. So you really need to have that ration balancer in there as well. If you're underfeeding your senior and performance feed, and you're not following the feeding directions, you really need to fill the gaps with a balancer or some other type of supplement to make sure the whole diet is really where it needs to be and balanced.
Well, those are great points. So we talked about forage and concentrate and supplements. Let's talk just a little bit about each one in particular. So forage, when you're looking at your forage, and a lot of people have a choice between grass hay, grass alfalfa mix, alfalfa, brome. I mean, there's just all kinds of forages. So what are you looking for if you're trying to feed a horse in the summer to make it digestible, maybe work its way through a little quicker so they're not, like you said, the internal combustion engine and heating up all the time?
Yeah, certainly this is a time for your better quality forages, right? Whatever sort of species of plant you go with, right? So whether it's brome or timothy or orchard or whatever, and if you've got a little bit of alfalfa in there too, whatever it is that you picked, this is the time for that slightly less mature, less stemmy, higher nutritional value hay, because it is going to be easier for them to ferment. That super stemmy, late cut, mature hay that I think of as being is a great hay for an easy keeper is not going to be such a good hay for that harder keeper, especially in the summer. So, this is where, having that, understanding forage quality and how, plants mature and being able to kind of look at a hay and say, okay, this one's, going to take a little bit more fermenting to get the nutrition out of it than this one that's got a little bit more leaf, a little bit less stem, was obviously cut at a slightly earlier stage. Now, if your horse does have metabolic issues, can be a bit of a challenge, because those less stemmy, more leafy hays are more likely to have a higher sugar and starch content, especially if the timothies and the orchards, those cold season grasses, will have a higher sugar content. So that may make them an inappropriate choice if you have a horse with metabolic problems. But the majority of horses that have metabolic problems don't tend to be, hard keepers. Although, some of those more senior cushion-oyed horses do fall into that, category. And I think it's worth mentioning, we mentioned at the beginning that, we're not talking about horses that have underlying health issues. But I think that there's definitely a group of people out there that are managing horses that they know they have a health issue, right? They know they're dealing with something like Cushing's or PPID. They've got them on Percent, they're managing them, and they're struggling to keep weight on them. I do think it's worth, checking back in with your vet. I mean, maybe your Percent dose needs to be tweaked. Maybe things are not, I definitely have clients who are a little bit guilty of, they've had the horse diagnosed a couple of years ago, and they haven't done a lot of follow-up since, right? It's kind of been stable, and there's perhaps not quite understanding, but that's a condition that you need to manage over time, and that your vet probably needs to be looking at that horse and drawing blood twice a year and making sure that, the medication dose is doing its job. So if you've got one of those horses and they're losing weight, really do check in with your vet.
So for our veterinarians who are listening to this podcast, that's probably something to add to your checklist. If you've diagnosed one of your clients' horses with PPID, you probably ought to be checking up with them on their weight.
Absolutely. And I think that, I have a lot of clients who aren't getting the information that their PPID horses should be having blood work done in the early fall, late summer, early fall. And I'm always recommending to my clients that have that diagnosis that they need to reach out to their vets at sort of around about Labor Day weekend, right, and have their blood work retested to make sure that their PPID horse is handling that seasonal rise in ACTH appropriately, and that they don't need to increase their medication during that seasonal rise period in September, October. And a lot of clients have no idea that there's even an ACTH rise that happens through the summer. They're not getting that education. And it's very emotional, to be honest. When you've got your horse, you have a PPID horse, you've got them on the medication, and then you end up with a horse that's foundered in late September because you didn't know that there was this ACTH rise, and they've had it for 3 years, and you've had them on the 1 milligram pill of Percent the last 3 years, they've been doing fine, and all of a sudden you go out one day in late September and they're standing there on their heels with laminitis, and they're like, what happened? And they had no idea that it's still a progressive disease, right? It's still progressing, and that they should be monitoring it over time, and that there's this ACTH rise through the late summer, and that maybe they need a little extra help with their medication at that time of year. And it's heart-wrenching to these people because they thought they were doing everything and they didn't know. So I'm always encouraging my clients that have PPID horses to reach out to their vets in the late summer, and that that's the time of year they should be getting. And there's a lot of confusing information out there because we used to say don't test in September, right? Because you couldn't get an accurate test. But when you look at the group from Tufts, my brain is forgetting the name of the working group for both EMS and PPID that put out the latest guidelines. They do recommend now that it is appropriate to test at that time of year, but with an ACTH test. So I think that's an important thing for people at this time of year to realize who are managing senior horses. And if your horse is starting to lose weight, especially at this time of year over the summer, it may be that that PPID is not being as well controlled as it should as the seasonal rise is occurring. So yeah, absolutely. It's a great opportunity to reach out to your clients, right, and have touch bases with them, and for sure.
Work on your summer scan. Enter for the chance to win a Global Pocket Reader Plus in Merck Animal Health's Sizzlin' Summer Sweepstakes giveaway. The Global Pocket Reader Plus is an ISO-compliant universal microchip scanner for horses. It is able to read and store up to 3,000 unique microchip identification numbers and displays and stores microchip temperatures when reading biothermo microchips. Enter before August 31, 2022 by going to www.merck-health-usa.com/species/summer-sweepstakes. And I want to go back a little bit when we were talking about the concentrates. So we talked about our forage, foundation is forage. We know that. But our concentrates, because some of these horses, we need to give them a few more calories than they can get. But we also, like you said, don't want to overload them or burn them up on this. Right. And you recommended some senior feeds, and there's a lot out there. So what should you look for? If you're a veterinarian and you've got a client whose horse, whether they're an older horse or not, what is he looking for to recommend to them, he or she, looking for to recommend to them to look for in a concentrate feed?
Looking at the feeding directions, looking at the guaranteed analysis, right? So if you're looking for something that's a little higher in fat, there are senior feeds out there that are kind of 10, 12% fat. Looking at the ingredient list, right? In the US, we list ingredients in decreasing order of inclusion. So what are the ingredients, right? I think that'll tell you a lot. The guaranteed analysis is great, but it also doesn't tell. There's a lot of things it doesn't tell you. It doesn't really tell you where the calories are coming from. Actually, in horses, we don't even put the calories on the bag, right? That is now, for any of your vets that do mixed practice will know that, that is now a requirement on small animal pet food bags. After much fighting and taking many, many years, they're now required to state the calorie content on those bags, but that is not a requirement on equine feed. So you're going in totally blind as far as what the calorie content is per pound. Some companies put that on their website. A good number do not. Most will give it to you if you phone them. But looking at the ingredient list, right? So what is your first ingredient? Is it beet pulp? Is it wheat middlings? Is there some vegetable oil, soybean oil, rice bran, oats? So it's going to be a higher, if you've got more high starch ingredients up front, like oats, cracked corn, steam flake barley, those kinds of things, that the majority of the calories in that feed are going to be coming from starch. If your first ingredients are things like beet pulp, soybean meal, beet pulp, soybean hulls, alfalfa meal, that kind of thing, that's going to be a higher fiber type, fermentable fiber type feed. And then you might see the oil in there, and you look at the label and you say, oh, it's 10% fat. Then you're like, okay, well, that fat's coming from that soybean oil. And it's a high fat, high fiber feed, and it's going to be generally a lower NSC feed. And perhaps safer if the client's horse is metabolic than the one that's got things like a lot of cracked corn, oats, barley, that kind of thing in it. So I think it's important to look at the ingredients. That'll tell you where are the calories coming from. Now, obviously, calories coming from the more grain type ingredients are going to be digested in the small intestine. They're not going to have that heat fermentation aspect to them because those are digested enzymatically in the small intestine. So maybe that's something you want to look for.
You don't have a metabolic horse. I mean, not all horses are metabolic.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely.
So you don't have to have these types of feeds for all horses. Again, which is why you should, veterinarians should consult with nutritionists if they don't know exactly what should go in, or if they do know, then they should make those recommendations to clients.
Absolutely. And I think, it's important to look at, what is the horse doing for a living? If this is a performance horse, show jumper, event horse, dressage horse, you got a little bit more, or barrel racer or whatever, you got a little bit more flexibility about what you can use as your ingredients as well, right? There's no, we've become very anti-starch, very anti-NSC. And I think you raised a really good point, Kim, that, yes, there is a large population of metabolic horses out there, but there's a huge population of horses that are not metabolic. And certainly the horse that's standing around without a job does not need to be fed high starch feed. But, these horses that are working hard, performance horses that, have a job to do and are struggling to maintain their weight, there is nothing wrong with feeding feeds that have grain in them. And many of our, we understand a little bit more now that, back in the day, think about things like wheat, barley, oats, corn. I mean, they range 40 to sort of 70% starch. Back in the day, that's what we fed, right? We fed cob, we fed straight grains, we were feeding a lot of starch. A lot of traditional racehorse feeds are over 30% starch. And now a lot of our performance feeds are, what I would call moderate starch. They're in that 20 to 25%, starch, sugar, 30% max, with maybe sort of an 8% fat. That's a very reasonable, guaranteed analysis for a performance horse that's working hard if they need extra calories from grains. So I don't think we should be afraid of starch. We just need to understand, who we're feeding, what their constraints are, what we're trying to achieve.
Now we're going to hit the big one, supplements. I mean, to me, the supplement that I trust the most, and it is a supplement, is the Ration Balancer. Mm-hmm. I mean, a good quality ration can do a lot for horses that are just on a forage diet.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, if your horse can maintain, so when I have a horse that's losing weight, I'll keep talking about the heat and what have you, but, the reality is when I have a client whose horse is underweight, the first thing I'd like to do is increase his forage, right? Because that's what they're designed to eat. So, that'll always be my go-to, is to feed more forage. And if I can maintain a horse's weight just by increasing the forage, then all I need is what's missing from that forage, which is going to be provided by that ration balancer. So absolutely. So, for all the conversations about performance feeds and senior feeds, I would much rather try and maintain a horse's weight by feeding more forage first. But if that doesn't do the trick, and there are definitely horses out there that they just won't eat any more hay, right? They're just not interested. Or you can't, and let's be honest right now, you can't find enough, you don't have enough hay available, right? Yeah. I mean, I think we have to, that's a reality right now. So you may not, you may be looking at your stack of hay saying, yeah, I'd love to feed more hay, but this is going to last me a year and I don't have the luxury, I can't really feed. I'm feeding 1.5% to 2% of body weight per day. Let's get that out there, right? We need to be feeding that kind of minimum 1.5%, 2% of body weight per day. Bare minimum, would be 1% of body weight. I don't like doing that, without a vet's recommendation. I think sometimes we end up with other problems when we go down to that little amount of forage. And if we're going to 1% of body weight of forage per day, then we're hopefully really putting some other stuff in there too, performance feeds and things. That's filling that gap. But yeah, you might be in a situation where it's just not a reality to feed more forage because you don't have that much forage available.
And I love the choice of oils, but you have to, as veterinarians and even horse owners who might be listening to this podcast, you need to start those slowly. So veterinarians make sure that they recommend that, okay, you can work your way up to 1 or 2 cups a day, but But how do you get it started? How can veterinarians recommend starting an oil, and what should they recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time if I'm recommending an oil just because I want a shiny coat and I want some omega-3s, then I'm looking at, maybe a quarter cup oil a day from a high omega-3 source like flax or camelina or the ahi oils or whatever, that kind of a thing. But those are the more expensive oils, let's be real. So if we're using oils for weight gain and wanting to do 2 cups a day, most people are not going to be using those kinds of oils for that purpose. It's often cost prohibitive, right? So, in an attempt to still get some omega-3s, then I'd be looking at canola or soybean oil. I generally stay away from corn oil. There's no omega-3 in corn oil. I think it's also really important to understand that when you feed an oil, especially a grocery store bought canola, soy, or corn oil, those have been refined to remove. As human consumers, we like everything to be uniform and the same color every time we go to the store. So those oils are heavily refined to remove all of the beta carotenes and all the color from them, so they're a uniform color. Because otherwise, one can of oil you go buy would be one color, and the next time you go back and buy canola oil again, it'd be a totally different color. So they've taken all those goodies out of it. And so really all you're getting from fat, from an oil source, is calories, right? You're not getting any zinc, you're not getting any protein, you're not getting any other nutrients. And so I think it's important to understand that if you are somebody, if you're going the route of hay, beet pulp, rice bran, or beet pulp and oil, or beet pulp, oats and oil, that kind of a thing, your diet is going to be deficient in some pretty important nutrients because you don't have any fortification source in there. That's the benefit of doing that high fat performance or senior feed, is it's got a trace mineral vitamin pack in it that is going to make sure that diet, when it's fed as prescribed by the manufacturer, is going to result in a diet that's properly balanced and doesn't have any deficiencies. When you add oil to a ration, you're only adding calories.
Okay, good point. And again, I love the fact that it's important for veterinarians if owners say, yeah, I've been feeding this senior feed, and they look at the bag and say, okay, so this one calls for, 5 pounds a day or whatever it is. Let's look at your scoop. Let's look at what you're doing. Let's measure it, because that is an issue. It's a lot of times they go, oh, I don't want to feed more than 2 scoops a day. And that turns out to be 3 pounds.
Right.
Or whatever. And, unfortunately, veterinarians have to deal with the horse owner's way of feeding. So they sometimes have to get into it that deep to try and solve the weight problem.
Absolutely. I mean, you do have to, if your client sort of says, oh, well, I'm feeding this senior feed, it holds up the bag, that's great. Then you have to follow up and say, well, how much are you feeding? And then you have to, and scoops or whatever doesn't cut it, because, you need to know what it weighs. So I would encourage, all the veterinarians out there, you should really have some kind of scale on your rig, Just buy yourself a fish scale. Actually, I love luggage scales because they're digital. And so I'm not looking at the little needle kind of going, is that 3.5 or is that 3 3/4? Is my, whatever. The luggage scales, you hold them out or whatever, and they zoom up and down with their numbers, and they eventually stabilize, and you get a solid number. You can just read the digital number. It's kind of idiot proof. $10, not even, on Amazon or somewhere, right? Really a good thing to have. So you should definitely have one of those. And weighing hay as well, right? So I know for a lot of the horse owners out there, it's not realistic to weigh hay. But that is I've seen that too. So I've seen horses losing weight, and it's because they got a new shipment of hay in, and the folks feeding, blessed, a lot of, boarding barns, different people feed every day of the week or whatever, or, the board says feed a flake, and you go from, we have these like mega alfalfa flakes down here, they're almost 10 pound a flake. Then we'll get a batch in, and you're lucky if the flake weighs 5 pounds. But some people are very literal. The board says feed 1 flake, and they're not super educated and they don't know that, well, that means now you need to feed 2 flakes, because when the board was written, those flakes were mega flakes, and now they're not mega flakes. And we had that happen, at a barn that I worked with, and all the horses started losing weight. We were like, what the heck is happening? And then we realized that there was a new person feeding, and nobody showed them what a flake was, right? Yeah. So there was this assumption they knew what a flake was. They thought they knew what a flake was, but, it wasn't the same. So, right. Weighing, if you can get your clients to weigh their hay, even just weigh a few flakes, you can wrap it up with a piece of baling twine, like a parcel, hang it on your luggage or fish scale, weigh 3 or 4 flakes and go, okay, so these flakes on average are, 5-6 pounds if it's a 3-string bale of grass hay, maybe 2 or 3 pounds if it's a 2-string bale of grass hay. A horse this size, 1,200 pounds, it needs, 1.5-2% of his body weight per day. So we're looking at 24 pounds of, hay for a 1,200 pound horse. Or 6 pound flake, you're looking at 4 flakes a day. What does your board say he's getting? Oh, 3. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a good starting point.
And also just the opposite, because if you go from feeding a grass hay or that type of hay, and then, okay, so you're trying to improve calories and you slowly transition to an alfalfa, you would think people would feel the difference in the weight of those flakes. But a lot of times it's like, you're struggling to carry 2 flakes of alfalfa hay, and, you've just suddenly really upped what the horse is getting.
Oh, absolutely.
You were feeding 4 flakes of grass hay, and if you feed 4 flakes of alfalfa hay, they may just be wasting it because they can't consume that much.
Right, absolutely. So I think it's not maybe realistic. Maybe your barn is not going to weigh hay every day. People get, but you can, and I think, when you get a new batch of hay in, if you've determined with your veterinarian or your nutritionist that your horse needs, whatever it needs, 24, 30 pounds, whatever the poundage of hay is, when you get a new batch of hay in, go repeat that exercise of, weighing 3 or 4 flakes and make sure that the 3 or 4 flakes in the new batch of hay is still giving you the poundage that you've determined your horse needs. Because maybe you need to change the board with this next squeeze of hay that came in, because I've seen that with the hay that come into our barn. Our pony, who's 900 pounds, he gets a flake of grass in the morning and a flake of grass in the evening and a flake of alfalfa. And there are times where, those are good solid 6-7 pound grass flakes, but we've had some tiny flakes come in and we've had to change the board to say, okay, well, for this batch, he needs to get 2 flakes.
Yeah.
Grass hay, or maybe it's not quite the same. So we end up with 2 flakes of grass in the morning and 1 flake of grass and 1 flake of alfalfa in the afternoon. It's like 3 flakes of grass ends up being the same as the previous 2 flakes, and you change the board for that batch of hay. So I'd encourage vets to get their owners to do that too. Again, we're talking about a 10-pound investment and maybe 10 minutes of your time, $10 investment. I got back from England, apparently. My brain is back on is back in pounds money, but a $10 investment on a scale and maybe 10 minutes of your time, and it can make a big difference. It really makes a difference. And wasting hay.
Yes.
And everyone's scrambling right now because feed prices are so expensive. Well, my number one thing to people is, well, first of all, don't waste it. I go into barns and it's like they're using it for bedding.
Yeah.
It's like, you can't stand there and be upset about the price, of hay or whatever, and then you're like throwing it on the manure heap because you're using it as bedding. That's just silly.
Yeah, it is. Well, in talking about just a normal horse that is losing weight because of the heat, the flies, the stress of summer, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Salt. Hydration is really important. And, they can get dehydrated pretty, or at least not be as hydrated as they should be pretty easily when it's this hot out. I mean, we arrive, and it's very interesting across our barn where we keep our horse. It's fascinating because we'll have a number of horses that are in very sort of identical living situations. some of them are just covered in salt. You arrive at 5 p.m, they are white across the top of their backs from the amount of salt on their backs. Other horses, not a patch of salt on them. It's really interesting. I'd love to understand the metabolic differences going on in those horses, why that's the case. And they're all, for the record, they're all sweaters. We're not talking the one that doesn't have salt is an anhydrotic horse. And these are all healthy sweating horses. It's just fascinating to me that some are, giving off a lot more salt than others. But giving salt, making sure they have salt available. And it is important that they are eating hay. There is when horses eat, forage, they are more likely to drink. The two kind of go together. So it is important that your horse is getting, enough forage. And if you're concerned about it and you're feeding, senior performance feeds or whatever, and you're worried about water intake, feed the feed wet, right? Add some water to it. Any way you can get water in is a good thing. But I'm a big believer in salt every day, 65 days of the year, and then giving electrolytes in addition when they're sweating heavily, because you're sort of 2 tablespoons of table salt a day. That's just meeting, the average horse's maintenance sodium requirements, standing around on a cool day not doing anything. That doesn't account for sweat losses. So I'm a big yes, they should have a salt block available, but I like the peace of mind of knowing that they're getting their minimum sodium requirement every day, because it does help keep them drinking. So I like to give them those 2 tablespoons of salt a day. It's about a tablespoon per 500-pound body weight is what is going to meet their maintenance sodium requirement. And then if they're working and sweating heavily, or like here right now, and it's, they're just sweating, standing around doing nothing, that's when you give your electrolyte in addition to the salt, because the purpose of the electrolyte is to replace the electrolytes lost in sweat. So those are really important for, maintaining weight as well.
Okay. Well, Dr. Thunes, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about, weight loss in horses in the summer. And I think there were some great points in here that can be followed up on. We want to thank our audience for listening to Disease du Jour, and a special thanks to our sponsor, Merck Animal Health. We invite you to listen to past episodes of Disease du Jour in case you missed one. And if you have any questions or suggestions, send an email to me at kbrown, that's the letter K Brown, at equinenetwork.com. Disease du Jour is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.